afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Connor Mercer, and this is Connor Collects. I discuss the history of gaming, my thoughts on said history, and my experiences collecting video games. If you remember our original run, I broke up the entire broad history of gaming into 4 parts. Today, and from here on out, we're going to be getting into much more specific topics. Have you heard of this thing called the Nintendo Switch? Released in 2017, the Nintendo Switch is a video game console from Nintendo, you don't say, and its main gimmick is that it can be used as a handheld. It also happens to be one of the best-selling video game consoles of all time. If you're unfamiliar, the Switch is a tablet with many console-like features. It has 2 attachable controllers on the side, which make up 2 halves of one whole controller, or 2 smaller controllers if you have friends. It has a dock for charging the battery and for connecting it to the TV. It has a controller support for up to 4 people, both on the TV and on the tablet. Lastly, it has games. Nintendo has essentially perfected the handheld home console hybrid format. However, they weren't the first to try it out. There are many different devices from throughout the years that could be argued as being hybrid consoles. Hell, the Switch isn't even Nintendo's first attempt at a device that lets you play home console games off the TV. This brings us to the terrible tragedy of the Wii U. The Wii U was the Switch's immediate predecessor. The Wii U console was tethered to the wall socket for power, invalidating its candidacy for hybrid console by default. However, it took many strides in getting Nintendo towards eventually realizing the Switch. The Wii U came with what they called the gamepad, a tablet-like device that beamed gameplay from the Wii U console onto its screen. Modern consoles, like the latest Xbox and PlayStation, have remote play, which allows you to play games without a TV on your phone or other device, and the Wii U is the earliest feasible example of what I'll call short-distance remote play, and what Nintendo called off-TV play. Earlier attempts at remote play, such as the PlayStation 3's connectivity with the PlayStation Portable, were marred with latency, lag, and low support for games. The Wii U was energized by the gamepad's unique features, yet crippled by its requirement in most games. The gamepad isn't the reason the Wii U failed, or even a reason, arguably, but many people were not thrilled that the Wii U gamepad teased a sort of portable experience that required you to be within 5 feet of the Wii U console. Nintendo took lessons learned from the Wii U and put them in the Switch, and the results speak for themselves. The actual horsepower of the Wii U lies in the console itself, which is tethered to your wall and TV. Gameplay is beamed to the gamepad from the TV-connected console, not the other way around. The Switch, meanwhile, puts all of its horsepower in the Switch tablet itself, which is beamed into the dock to the TV. I've had a Wii U since Christmas 2012, and it's one of my favorite gaming consoles. I actually use it more than the Switch these days because it can play original Wii games from back in the day. People online are begging Nintendo for Zelda Wind Waker on Switch, but until I can play Mario Kart Wii on my Switch, I'm keeping the Wii U. Regarding the Wii U itself, it has some stellar games. It has the 2 best versions of the 2 best Zelda games, that being Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, neither of which I've beaten to the fullest yet. I'm working on it. Many games use the gamepad as a second screen instead of an off-TV screen, leading to games like Game & Wario and Nintendo Land. Nintendo Land is a minigame collection party game that pits 4 against 1. 4 players use regular Wii remotes and the TV, and 1 player uses the gamepad and no TV. The 1, via the gamepad, gets information the 4 don't. In the Luigi's Mansion minigame, the 4 are ghost hunting Mario Brothers, and the 1 is the ghost. The ghost's location is hidden on the TV, visible only to the 1 on the gamepad. Nintendo Land can also pit 1 against 1 or 1 teaming up with 1 in some minigames. In the Zelda minigame, 1 person on the TV uses a sword and shield, and 1 person on the gamepad uses a bow and arrow. The 2 different controller types allow for 2 different control schemes. Nintendo Land is chock full of minigames like this that take full advantage of the gamepad. Most games, however, generally only use the gamepad as an off-TV device, which allows some ease of use porting to the Switch. The Switch has an unbelievable amount of Wii U ports. Because of the Wii U's low sales numbers and the Switch's high sales numbers, millions of Switch owners have never touched a Wii U in their lives. This allows Nintendo to literally print money. All they have to do is take a Wii U game, port it to Switch, and sell it for full price. The game was finished years ago, and they get to sell it to people who've never played it for full price. Many of the Switch's best games are actually Wii U ports. Breath of the Wild spent most of its development as a Wii U exclusive before being ported to Switch. Many Nintendo-made ports simply add the word deluxe to the name and add a few neat trinkets to get those 2.5 Wii owners to double dip. I actually got the Switch for my birthday in June of 2017. I was at the tail end of middle school. Since the school year was pretty much over, my history teacher actually let me play it in class, and I played Mario Kart 8 Deluxe with the kid next to me. Shout out to Mr. Busso. The Switch isn't hard to collect for, per se, but it is expensive. Since it's so damn popular, Nintendo never does any price cuts. Every single Nintendo-made Switch game still costs $60. Remember, the Switch came out when I was in middle school, and I graduate college this year if I'm lucky. I didn't take a gap year either. Maybe if we're lucky, some of the games will finally get their prices cut when the Switch 2 comes out. I wrote that several months ago, by the way. How's that turning out for us? Alright, everyone's heard of the friggin' Switch and the Wii U. You're here for the good stuff. You saw a Sega Nomad and PSP on the thumbnail and thought, wow, I want to see the Sega Nomad and the PSP. And by God, you're gonna get it. There were many attempts from many companies to get their home consoles and arcade experiences onto a handheld form factor. Most companies simply ported their games to Game Boy at the cost of color, firmware, hopes, and dreams. Some companies released handheld versions of their home consoles, especially in the 90s. The Turbo Express is a handheld variant of the TurboGrafx 16, neither of which I have. Meanwhile, in the early 2010s, Sony started a cross-buy program which allowed you to buy one version of a game on PlayStation 3 and then get a free digital copy on the PS Vita, or vice versa. This ended up being a precursor to the cross-gen system many games use today, where if you buy a PlayStation 5 game, you might also get the PS4 version for free. But back to the handhelds. There is one device which I think could be argued as a true attempt at a hybrid gaming console, the Sega Nomad, a portable version of the Sega Genesis. The Genesis was released in America in 1989 and primarily competed with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. An early lead against Nintendo was almost immediately hamstrung by internal conflicts between Sega's American and Japanese divisions, which caused Sega as an entity to do some very stupid things. We all know the story. The Sega CD was an add-on for the Genesis that released its games on the CD format. The 32X was another add-on for the Genesis that gave the console 3D abilities. The Sega Saturn was the successor to the Genesis. All of this sounds fine and dandy until you remember that all four of these had their own game libraries, and the latter three came out within 3 years of each other. One of Sega's many desperate attempts to cling on to their 15 minutes of fame was the Nomad, released exclusively in America in 1995. Unlike every other product they'd released thus far, the Nomad did not have its own library of games. Instead, it exclusively played Sega Genesis games. This on its own is pretty neat already, but it does quite a bit more than you'd think. The Nomad, as a handheld, primarily competed with the Game Boy. When you compare the aforementioned Game Boy ports with their console counterparts, it's not even close. The Nomad kicks the Game Boy's ass in raw power simply because of it being a portable version of a home console. The Nomad also has two major features that bring it up to line with a traditional home console: local multiplayer and TV out. Most handhelds usually have some type of local multiplayer. However, it is usually a case of 2 copies of a game running on each device, connected wired or wirelessly, with each person getting their own screen, that being the screen of the handheld itself. You could compare this to a LAN multiplayer game on a PC or home console. Does anyone else remember playing Halo with 2 TVs and 2 consoles and 2 copies of Halo? I don't. I was born in 2003. Anyway, the Nomad's multiplayer is much more in line with the traditional couch co-op of a standard home console. 2 players, each with their own controller, play the same game on the same screen. How does this work on a portable console like the Nomad, you may ask? This brings us to TV out. Obviously, when you hook up an Xbox or a Switch, it's connected to a screen of some kind, usually a TV, occasionally a computer monitor. You sit on the couch, controller in hand, look up at the TV, and you play your game. The Nomad can do that. Using the standard Sega Genesis video cable, model 2 of 2, you too can connect your Sega Nomad to a TV. Then, your friend sitting directly next to you can plug his Sega Genesis controller directly into the Sega Nomad, and you too can play the many Sega Genesis multiplayer games. Now all I need to do is find friends. So what makes the Nomad a hybrid, in my opinion? The Sega Genesis as a device is the console itself, connected to a TV, controlled by a controller. Because the Nomad can connect to a TV, and because it has all of the multiplayer features of the actual Genesis, the Nomad can act as a full replacement to the Genesis. Unless, of course, you're one of the 12 people on Earth with a Sega CD or 32X. The Nomad doesn't work with those, but who has those anyway? Unfortunately, I can't play any of my 32X or Sega CD games on my Nomad. The 32X is actually why I wanted a Genesis in the first place. Back in around 2021, I wanted a 32X for God knows why. There were 3 games that caught my eye: Virtual Racing, Star Wars Arcade, and Doom. Once I had those, I started to collect Genesis games. I got utter classics and must-haves, such as Jeopardy, Miss Pac-Man, and Toy Story. These games are obviously the only games any living creature ever needs. Guess what? They're also Nomad games. I got my Nomad a couple of weeks ago, and this particular model has a modded screen with a brighter backlight. And I also picked up the battery pack. Strap in, liberals, because this thing eats 6 AA's in just 3 hours. That's an entire battery every 30 minutes. For context, the original Game Boy got 30 hours off of 4 AA's, and later models got over 10 hours off of 2 AA's. Battery vor isn't the only reason Game Boy competitors didn't take off. In 1995, the Nomad cost $180. A Game Boy cost no more than $90, and an actual Sega Genesis was down to just $100. For portability alone, the Nomad was just too expensive for too many people when the Genesis was right there at the same time. People seemed quite content with Nintendo's Game Boy line until Sony drop-kicked the PlayStation Portable onto store shelves in 2004. I don't think the PSP quite reaches the level of hybrid console that the Switch or even Nomad reach, but it comes pretty damn close. The PSP is not a handheld variant of any existing console like the Nomad. It also did not compete with home consoles of its era like the Switch. It did, however, attempt to bring the home console experience to a portable form factor in a way that was not quite successfully replicated since. The PSP's main competitor was the Nintendo DS, a handheld that focused much less on raw power than anything else. Early DS games liked to show off its capabilities, but later DS games ended up being mostly puzzle platformers or niche mobile app predecessors like Nintendogs. There aren't a whole lot of DS games that really push the DS, especially in its later years. When you put the PSP next to the DS, it looks like a Greek god. The DS had Brain Age, the PSP had Grand Theft Auto. The DS had Mario vs. Donkey Kong, the PSP had God of War. Sony brought a lot of games known for being quite impressive on a home console and ported them in nigh uncompromised fashion onto the PSP. However, this on its own is not enough to make any handheld a hybrid console. The PSP, just like the Nomad, has TV out. You can buy AV or component cables and hook your PSP up to the TV. This is also great because the PSP has hundreds of movies and TV shows on its UMD disc format, and you can watch all of those on a TV from the PSP. A couple of months ago, I was watching Batman Begins on my PSP on my TV in my living room. At the same time, my mom had just gotten back from a day in the city with my aunt and cousin, and they all ended up staying to finish the movie. Nobody realized they were watching a PSP movie, which I always thought was pretty funny. I actually have another funny story about the PSP. When I was a kid, my dad bought my brother and I each a Game Boy Advance. A few years later, we both got our own DS. A few more years after that, the PSP. Unfortunately, for tiny, unaware 6-year-old me, I was too attached to my DS to even notice I had a PSP. As the years went by, I actually forgot that I even had my own PSP until around 2020, when I made the shocking discovery that my dad's PSP, the one he's had for years and years, is actually the one he brought for me as a kid that I never used. My next birthday gift, probably around 2021, was a PSP. I had a lot of lost time to make up. The PSP has a lot of PS2 ports. A lot of my favorite PS2 games from my childhood are on PSP. Pac-Man 3, Pac-Man World Rally, Star Wars Battlefront, and Lego Star Wars are all on PSP. Of course, there are plenty of other games. PS2 games that didn't get direct ports likely got a spin-off of some kind. Jak and Daxter on PS2 became Daxter on PSP, which ended up being one of the first PSP games I bought. Alright, so we've established that the PSP can hook up to your TV. What else can it do? Sony's home consoles were known for their media capabilities. Millions and millions of people bought a PlayStation 2 simply because it had a built-in DVD player. The PSP is a multimedia powerhouse. You can import songs and videos onto it like an iPod. The aforementioned UMD discs were how Sony distributed PSP games, but they also released movies, TV shows, and music on the UMD. The PSP's multimedia features made it feel a lot closer in scope to the home consoles of its era. As a matter of fact, the PSP actually had a model down the line that brought it even closer to the Switch. In 2009, Sony released the PSP Go, a smaller version of the PSP with a form factor that resembled a cell phone of the day. Sold separately, you could get a dock for the PSP Go that charges it and connects it to a TV. When docked, you could also connect a PlayStation 3 controller via Bluetooth. Sound familiar? I personally don't have any of these, and I probably won't ever for a couple of reasons. The PSP Go doesn't support discs. An unmodded PSP Go requires you to download all of your games from the PlayStation Store. If you have any games or movies on disc, you're out of luck. Additionally, to connect a controller, you need to pair the PSP Go and the controller to a PlayStation 3, which sounds like a pretty cumbersome experience. Finally, the PSP Go and dock are crazy expensive on eBay, and I already have a regular PSP and its video cables. I'm not going to spend more money on a device that does something I already can do, and I suspect many customers back in the day felt the same way because the PSP Go was discontinued in 2011, just 2 years after its release, and almost 4 years before the other models of the PSP were discontinued. The Sega Nomad and PlayStation Portable were, in my opinion, the two closest attempts the gaming industry ever got to a Nintendo Switch before Nintendo actually went and made the Nintendo Switch. There is, however, one thing I'd like to mention. In 2011, a few years after the PSP came out, Sony released the PS Vita. It is decidedly not a hybrid console. You cannot plug it into a TV, you cannot connect the controller to it. However, there were plans to actually allow the PS Vita to connect to a TV. In 2013, Sony released the PS Vita TV, known in America as the PS TV. It is essentially a consoleized PlayStation Vita. It does not have any built-in screen controls or battery. You plug it into the wall, you plug it into the TV, and you connect the controller to it. It doesn't support every PS Vita game. It was discontinued fairly quickly. So what's the point? Many people point to the PS TV as being the prime reason Sony never gave the PS Vita an official AV cable. As a matter of fact, the PS Vita actually has a built-in scaler that supports 1080i. There's also an unused port at the top of the unit. It is widely believed that the port on top of the PS Vita would have been used for an AV or HDMI cable, and the scaler would have upscaled the Vita's low resolution to an HD TV. With the release of the PS TV, however, Sony would have no reason to do this. Why spend $20 on an AV cable when you could spend $100 on a brand new unit? Thanks, Sony. Really cool. I actually wanted a PS TV more than the Vita when I was looking into buying one. Unfortunately, having an unmodded PS TV means you need a comprehensive list of every supported game in case you accidentally buy a game that doesn't work. Eventually, I got tired of doing this and I went and bought an actual PS Vita as well. My favorite games on the Vita are probably Persona 4 Golden and Tearaway. Persona 4 is an RPG where you investigate murders that occur in an alternate dimension, and Tearaway is a 3D platformer where you deliver mail. Alright, so none of these things, the Nomad, the PSP, the Vita, the Wii U, can do every single thing that the Switch can do. However, the different features mixed and matched in each device laid the groundwork for Nintendo to perfect the hybrid format with the Switch. The Switch, being a handheld console, arguably fought an uphill battle. In 2017, the handheld gaming market had stagnated and was losing badly to the mobile app market. The Switch reversed this trend. Just a few years later, Valve dropped the Steam Deck, a PC handheld hybrid that also supports external controllers and TV out. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all for today's Connor Collects. Next week, we'll delve into the wonderful world of SpongeBob games. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a great one.